Welcome to our episode today. Our topic of focus is the glutes, which we thought would just be an interesting topic to set aside an episode to actually focus on because it seems like at least in our experience it seems like the topic of the glutes is kind of like everywhere you turn in the yoga world, in the fitness and movement world, and in the therapeutic worlds as well. It seems like everywhere you turn you tend to hear about the glutes, like it's kind of a trendy, seems like maybe a somewhat of a trendy buzz term these days. But for example, we tend to hear that just in general, having strong glutes is important. We tend to hear that it's important to strengthen the glutes in order to treat pain, like if someone has back pain or knee pain or hip pain or SI joint pain, like all these pains, it's often claimed that strengthening the glutes is important to treat that pain. It's also often claimed that strengthening the glutes is important to prevent injuries and to prevent pain in general. What else about the glutes? It's also claimed that it's important to strengthen the glutes in order to, quote, correct posture, like to correct bad posture. Often glute strengthening is prescribed to like change posture into a more, quote, optimal posture. Other terms that we tend to hear about, or statements that we tend to hear, are that it's important to activate the glutes, like before we work out, like do some sort of exercise or even yoga, like this idea that we need to activate our glutes before that so that they work better for us during the activity. There also, you may have tuned into this, but there's also kind of like it's like a societal trend. I would suggest that having well developed glutes, like aesthetically, is kind of this an aesthetic ideal that many people aspire to. So targeting the area of the glutes to change how they look, um, that's also another way that the glutes kind of tend to be pulled out and focused on. We also tend to hear claims about people having a sleep glutes, or something sometimes called gluteal amnesia. And that's often talked about as being because people sit all day and then that like turns off or shuts off their glutes. So they're just, as you can see, that's a long list. Oh, and there's one more that I wanted to mention, which was just that specifically in yoga, when it comes to back bends, and especially it's really all back bends, but I feel like bridge pose and wheel pose, and we'll talk about it a little more in a moment. But specifically with those, there are these ideas, strong ideas about what the glutes should be doing or shouldn't be doing in back bends. So it's kind of a long list of ways that I tend to see the glutes pulled out and focused on in general in like the yoga movement, fitness, therapeutic worlds. Travis, do you have anything to add to that, or do you agree with that list?
That's a strong list. I think there are a lot of misconceptions out there and they're ripe for the debunking.
Totally. I'm glad you agree. Yeah, so we thought we could take some time today to just take a little closer look at some, maybe all of those claims, but just like kind of a good look at what science might suggest about some of these things we tend to hear about the glutes. One other thing I wanted to throw out there, if you kind of consider that long list that I laid out, is that at least in my experience, it seems like the main emphasis on the glutes is that everybody's glutes are either underactive or weak, and they therefore need to be strengthened, or something needs to be done to kind of rev them up again. It's not so much that we tend to hear about the glutes that they need to be relaxed, or they're too tight or something like that. Although it is true that there are, in the yoga world at least, sometimes there are myofascial release, quote, release techniques with balls, and sometimes there are some like actual glute targeted ball releases. So it's not that the glutes are never brought up as something that need to be, quote, released or relaxed or that side of things, but on the whole it seems like it's more about they need to be charged up. Would you agree, Travis?
Yeah, I think that's true. There are certainly stretches that you do even on a yoga mat, like supine figure four, where
Mm-hmm.
you're definitely stretching the glutes, but I don't know that people are going out of their way to highlight the need for stretching the glutes or releasing the glutes so much as strengthening the glutes being the primary
Right.
focus.
I think that's at least when it comes to the verbiage or how it's discussed, because you're so right that a reclined figure four or like a reclined pigeon pose is fully a glute stretch. Yet I don't know if I've ever really heard in a yoga context, at least a yoga teacher say we're stretching our glutes in this pose. The verbiage that tends to be used in my experience is that it's a hip opener, a quote hip opener, which then obviously that does mean that like the glutes cross the hip and they're being stretched, but it just doesn't seem like the focus is made so much on the hip. I mean, on the glutes.
Mm-hmm. Which is weird.
Right. Because yeah. I don't know. I just think there's these weird ideas in this area of the body. They get wrapped up in how we talk about the body. We talk about the glutes when we think they need to be strengthened or something. But when it's coming to stretching or massaging them, it's maybe a little less about the glutes and just more that it's a hip opener or something. I don't know.
Yeah,
Just
which is further silly because the glutes extend to the hip, but so do the hamstrings. And
yeah.
people don't talk about hamstring strengthening too much in yoga, right? And
Yeah.
there aren't that many opportunities in a traditional mat practice to strengthen the hamstrings. So why aren't we talking about strengthening the hamstrings the way that we're talking about strengthening the glutes?
That's a really good point. Yeah, we hardly ever strengthen the hamstrings in any sort of meaningful way in a yoga practice. Another another muscle that also happens to extend the hips that I feel like we rarely hear discussed is adductor magnus. I'm getting a little anatomy geeky now, but we have five adductor muscles, and one of them crosses the back of the hip, and that's adductor magnus, and it also works as a hip extensor and is a primary muscle that's targeted in things like squats, for example. We tend to hear squats discussed as being about strengthening the glutes, or one of the main things they do is they strengthen the glutes, but they also really target adductor magnus. So that's interesting
Nobody's
too.
talking
Like,
about adductor magnus.
yeah, no, I think, yeah, I feel like I hear the hamstrings talked about more than adductor magnus. Like that seems to be even lower on the list. Yet it's involved in a lot of, well, yeah, many of the hip extension activities we do. So you mentioned
Especially when
hip.
the legs are in like a wider position, like a sumo or goddess
Mm-hmm.
stance.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What's the other name
Totally.
for that? Isn't there one other?
Goddess. Horse stance.
That's it. Yep.
Yeah, that's the one I tend to have like learned in my upbringing in the yoga world. You mentioned hip extension, you brought that up, and we did want to make sure we kind of laid out a bit of like the anatomy of the glutes and what we're even talking about in this conversation as far as this area of the body. So maybe Travis, could you explain like what hip extension is, and maybe we could talk just a bit about glutes anatomy?
Yeah. So the glutes are actually three different muscles.
Hmm.
There's the gluteus maximus, which is probably the one that people think of the most when they say glutes. And then there's the gluteus minimus and the gluteus medius. So the
Right.
glute max is the primary hip extender. And so hip extension is when you go from sitting to standing. So your hips go
Hmm.
from a flexed position to an extended position. And
Hmm.
then the minimus and medius are hip abductors primarily. And so they take the leg, if you are standing and you lifted the leg out to the side, then, or if
Hmm.
maybe if you were lying on your side and you're doing a Jane Fonda leg lift up into the air,
Hmm. Hmm.
that's hip abduction. And so those muscles are responsible for that. They're also really important because when we walk, we have to
Hmm.
isometrically abduct our hip so that our hip doesn't drop. And so
Hmm.
those muscles, they're small but important. If we have weakness there, or pain or injury, then that affects our gait. And so
Hmm.
those small muscles do play an important role, and maybe not as widely thought of or discussed when it comes to the glutes are primarily the glute, like people think about the glute max and maybe don't think about minimus and medius. And they all
Right.
three of them, I think, also externally rotate the hip, at least to some degree, or
I
in
think
different
so.
positions. It's kind of
Hmm.
confusing because depending on what angle of hip flexion you're in,
Hmm.
like different muscles can turn into internal and external rotators.
That's
So
right. Especially with the
I
glute.
try not to
Yeah.
get too caught up in that minutia, but you got it.
I
What
don't
is it
know.
like? Obturator, something or other,
Obturator
like
intern. One.
turns into an
Oh,
internal rotator or external rotator in deep hip flexion.
if we want to get really anatomy geeky, I've learned that is the piriformis muscle
Okay,
does that because
I
the
buy it.
yeah, that yeah, piriformis is normally that's one of our deep external rotators. We have like six of those. And the piriformis does external rotation generally, but like you said, if we're in hip flexion beyond a certain degree, then the piriformis actually does internal rotation. And that's partly why something like pigeon pose, which actually externally rotates the hip, is often called like a piriformis stretch, because even though it's in the direction of motion that piriformis does, in that hip flex position, piriformis is an internal rotator. And so therefore that external rotation position stretches it. I know that's a really geeky aside, but yeah, it can get a little minutiae.
Is it worth bringing up like the different attachment points?
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe,
Maybe in a general way.
yeah.
Yeah,
Take it away.
so okay, I'll do my best. So you described, I think, really well, like just the basic actions and function of gluteus maximus, medius, and minimus. And just to kind of clarify a little more for our listeners, gluteus maximus is more on the posterior, more on the backside, and it kind of
Mm,
wraps around a little bit
yeah,
laterally, but it's like your behind basically is gluteus maximus. But then when we're talking about gluteus medius and minimus, those are much more lateral. They're like really just straight out on the sides of your
they're
hips.
also like more superior than one might think.
Hmm.
Like when you think,
Hmm.
oh, it's on the side, I just kind of envision it on the side, but it's actually kind of high up on the side. It's kind of
Oh,
if
yeah.
you look
Yeah, yeah,
at
yeah.
pictures of bodybuilders, like male bodybuilders with really well developed glutes and really low percent body fat, you can see like this fan shaped muscle that's the glute max. And
Right.
then you can see the minimus or medius, whatever one's
Hmm.
more superficial. Medius is more
Yeah, medius
superficial.
is more superficial. Yeah,
Yeah. And then minimus, you probably can't see underneath medius. But anyway,
exactly.
when you see where that is, you're like, that's not where I would expect that muscle to be.
I know what you mean. And I think maybe that's partly because our pelvis, like the pelvic bowl, like the actual kind of top of the pelvis, which is called the iliac crest, that top crest of your ilium where you could kind of dig your hands in, like where you might put like a child, if you were carrying your child quote on your hip or something, kind of hook it in there on the iliac crest. That's actually, I think, a lot higher than we often realize. But if you actually just palpate in there in your own body, you might sense it's up there, because the gluteus medius, that the lateral glute muscle, it attaches up there. Like actually, I think both medius and maximus and minimus, they all attach up on the iliac crest, which is pretty high. And then gluteus maximus, like we said, it's more posterior. It also attaches to your sacrum and your tailbone or your coccyx, which is one of my favorite anatomical words, coccyx, just saying. The way it's spelled, and it's kind of a good word. But anyway, gluteus maximus attaches there, and then it also attaches to the femur, that's your thigh bone, at a place called the gluteal tuberosity, and then it also attaches to the IT band, which is probably a structure many of our listeners have heard about before, the iliotibial band, which is this thick band of fascia or connective tissue that runs along the outer thigh all the way down and crosses the knee.
Which is
So,
crazy because of when you think about where the glutes start on the iliac crest to go
mm-hmm,
all the way into the IT band to then insert
mm-hmm.
on the tibia, like
Yeah,
that goes a long way.
that's so true. So like the line of pull or the effect of the force generation of the gluteus maximus can really affect all the way down the leg past the knee to the tibia, which is one of our lower leg muscles. So yeah, it's like a broad reach that muscle has, really, especially when you think about the IT band. And then, so that's glute max, and then gluteus medius and minimus. They're, like I said, they're on the sides. They don't attach to the IT band, but they're more basically just the side of the pelvis. So the iliac crest down to this prominence on your thigh bone called the greater trochanter. And some of our listeners may be familiar with the greater trochanter, and some maybe not. But it's just kind of that bony prominence you can kind of bang into with your hands on either side, kind of like the upper outer thigh,
Do you,
basically.
when you let's see if I can describe this. So if you put your heel kind of in front of you, you're standing and you lift your
Mm-hmm.
toes up and you wiggle your toes in and
Oh,
out, if you
Yeah,
put your finger on the
oh,
side of
that's a
your
really
hip,
good
you
idea.
can feel the greater tuberosity, like that
The
prominence
greater
moving back and
trochanter.
forth. Sorry, greater trochanter
Oh, I see
going
what
back
you're
and forth.
saying. Because you're rotating the thigh and you can feel that bony
Mm-hmm.
prominence moving. Oh, that's a good I'm gonna try that really quickly right now. That's a really good teaching tool for teaching that. Yeah.
Yeah, when we were in grad school doing gait biomechanics, we would have to put markers on, different
Yes.
bony prominences for the cameras to pick it up, and so you have to make sure that you're placing those markers repeatably, and so
Correct.
that's how you have the person do that motion, and then you can feel
Oh, that's so cool
where
to
that
know.
is
So
to
that
place
you
the
you
marker.
make sure you place the marker on the right spot in everybody's body, like across
Mm-hmm,
bodies.
mm-hmm. So you can do it the same if you brought the person in again, or your colleague could place it the same way
Hmm.
on the same person.
That makes sense. So there's like consistency across what's being measured between
Mm-hmm,
bodies and between
mm-hmm.
people who are actually placing those markers.
Yep.
Very cool. Yeah. So that that prominence, the greater trochanter, that's where gluteus medius and minimus attach, the bottoms of those muscles. And yeah, so that's kind of what's up with the glutes. They're basically the back of the hips, and then they wrap around and they're on the side of the hips. And they're three different muscles. And collectively, we tend to just throw out this term glutes to kind of refer to all of it, but it can be really helpful to break down the individual structures and just understand them, like where they are and what they each do, because they are unique.
And they typically get auto-corrected to flutes, which is very, very confusing when you're texting with people about the
You're
glutes.
so, yeah, it's so true. Like when you're typing on your phone or whatever, the
Yeah.
iPhone
Why
wants to
won't
call them
why
flutes.
won't iPhone learn?
That is so true. I've experienced that so many times. Which also just shows how much we tend to write glutes, because glutes is just like this term that's used often out there. Much we write about glutes and talk about glutes, like you said, much more than adductor magnus, for example. But yeah, so the flutes. So anyway, now that we've kind of laid out a picture of kind of where the glutes are, what they do, their anatomy, one of the first things we wanted to talk about in this conversation was kind of specific to yoga. And it's that topic that I mentioned earlier, which was the glutes in backbends. Because I find that this is kind of a hotly contested topic in the yoga world. And Travis, I know like you're a total yogi, but you come from like fitness and strength and conditioning background. And so what did you think when you first learned about like these controversies around yoga backbends and whether or not the glutes should be active?
So you told me that
Mm-hmm.
some people say that you should relax the glutes in a backbend.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was preposterous because you're trying to go into hip extension, like
Right.
a pretty terminal hip extension if you're getting into like wheel pose or bow
Mm-hmm.
pose or any of
Mm-hmm.
those things. And how could you get into that position if your glutes are not fire, if you're purposely trying to relax the glutes? So that doesn't make any sense to me. But then you mentioned to me that there are other people who say, oh, you need to really focus on a strong glute contraction in a back bend. And it's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
how can
Do you
both
need
of these extremes exist if some people are on the one end are
exactly
saying, oh, you need to relax the glutes, and others are saying, oh, you need to violently contract the glutes? And
right?
my background upbringing was, oh, for exercises that are we're engaging the glutes in a high load scenario. So there's an
Mm-hmm.
exercise like a loaded glute bridge with weight across your hips, or
Mm-hmm.
another exercise where your shoulders are elevated and you're doing a glute bridge, which we call a hip
A
thrust.
hip thrust,
You
right?
might even have a barbell with heavy load on it. Like,
Heavyweights, yeah.
yeah, you absolutely need to be thinking about contracting your glutes powerfully to elicit the proper positioning and direct the stimulus where you want it to go. So I lean more towards that from a heavy lifting standpoint. Same thing, maybe even with a deadlift, where
Mm-hmm.
when you deadlift where you're picking the bar up off the floor, you probably want to be engaging your glutes at the lockout position. So when you're standing up at the top,
Mm-hmm.
to kind of finish the movement and achieve full hip extension. And so there are certainly scenarios where I think you need to engage the glutes like consciously.
Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about a yoga pose where the loads are, you don't have weight,
Mm-hmm.
external
It's just
load
body
involved.
weight.
Yeah. I guess I would say I would lean more towards not volitionally relaxing them. So if you were going to do anything,
Mm-hmm.
maybe contract them. But at the same time, these are body weight movements, and maybe you don't have to think about doing anything in particular with your glutes at all.
I love that.
Maybe they'll
And
just do what they're going to do, and that'll be fine.
maybe your body can self-organize in our yoga
Yeah, and it's
poses.
it's
And
different, if something funky's happening when they're going into a back bend, and they
mm-hmm.
need to be cued a certain way, that's one thing. But to blanket say, oh,
Mm-hmm.
everyone should relax their glutes and wheel, everyone should tense their glutes in bow, like it's hard to make those one size fits all cues,
100%.
especially in this context.
Yeah, right. In a context of yoga, where just to be clear, like in a yoga practice, we're not strength training. We're not targeting any specific area of the body. At least not in the way and it's not in a loaded sense, like you pointed out, like in the gym, people do hip thrusts with it can be hundreds of pounds that they're
Mm-hmm.
lifting up with their hips, that they're intentionally loading their glutes. But that's a little different than just body weight bridge pose done on the yoga mat, where we're lying on our back, knees bent, feet flat, and we lift our hips up. Like that's very low load, and it's not really very strengthening of course that's like a relative term and it depends on the body that's doing the movement, but in general, yoga asana and the practice of yoga is less about like really strength training, and it's also not so much about something called hypertrophy training, which would be like training to actually grow a muscle, like we talked about earlier, the aesthetic goals of having well developed glutes and how that tends to be like an emphasis in our culture these days. In a yoga context, we don't tend to have that type of emphasis woven in. Like most yoga classes are not trying to get people to intentionally build bigger booties or whatever. Like that's just not really yoga's about. In my mind, it's more about like embodying these positions like in a whole body manner, and it's not so much about we're targeting this one muscle this one way. And it's body weight, and we don't. And yeah, I think it's interesting because in the course of teaching yoga asana over the past, I don't know, like couple decades, I feel like I have seen this trend where everybody was teaching that it was really important to relax the glutes in yoga, in like bridge and wheel and bow and all of those. And the idea was that the reason we were supposed to relax the glutes in these back bends was that contracting the glutes was bad, and that it could, like, because there's a reason why, like, people don't, like, they're saying that because they believe that contracting the glutes could, one very common claim that I tended to hear was that it could jam the SI joints, the sacroiliac joints.
That was what you told me. You were like, "Oh yeah, people
Mhm.
say not to contract the glutes because it jams the SI joint." I'm like, "What the heck does that even mean?"
What I think that's the first thing you said to me when I told you that. And I love that. Like, what does that mean? Like, so these terms just thrown around for actions and effects in the body when they don't even really have what does jam mean when you're talking about like a joint? What is that? The SI joint is like it's one of the most, if not the most stable joints in the human body. And it takes super high forces, like traumatically high forces, like a car accident or something, to actually like dislodge or cause injury actually to the SI joint. And when you contrast thinking of something like that to thinking of something of lying on your back and lifting your hips up in bridge pose, like the forces involved in those two are just so extremely different. Plus, what does jam the SI joint even mean? But that's super widespread claim in my experience as far as why it was important to relax the glutes. Another claim would kind of be to throw the low back in there. That like if you contracted the glutes and back bends, that would, I think jam was the term used again, but jam your low back, or crunch is another term I've heard. Crunch the low back. Just all these kind of
Yeah,
scary
and
words.
so I guess the one, if you think about the anatomy or the functional anatomy, when you engage the glutes, you do posteriorly tilt the pelvis.
Mm-hmm.
And in a back bend, I suppose you would rather have an anterior tilted pelvis to achieve full lumbar extension, because those
Mm-hmm.
two kind of go hand in hand.
They go
So I
together.
could see how, if you're violently posteriorly tilting the pelvis, that would work against you in achieving full lumbar, full spinal extension,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because you're tilting the pelvis back. That would reverse the lumbar curvature, so that would tend to flex if you
Mm-hmm.
posteriorly tilt the pelvis, that would flex the lumbar spine. So I sort of can understand why you wouldn't necessarily want a really strong glute contraction volitionally, but to then say, oh, you have to totally relax your glutes, like that just doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense
Your
because
hips need to be an extension.
and that's what the
If
glutes
your glutes
do,
are
right?
relaxed, what's gonna, okay, so you're telling me I need to relax my glutes, so I'm gonna extend my hips with my hamstrings? Like,
Which you could do. I mean, that could be,
I
but
guess,
again,
yeah.
yeah.
The
Like,
muscles
why is
work
that
together.
important?
Yeah.
Exactly. To just they synergistically work to coordinate hip extension. And we don't necessarily need to pull out like certain muscles as being the ones to use. Like our nervous system is pretty sophisticated and smart, and it kind of knows which muscle fibers to fire in order to accomplish a task. And it just seems yet one more example of the many ways that we like to micromanage and kind of nitpick all these little details of yoga poses when that just might not be necessary, and maybe it's leading us down a less productive path. But I did just want to throw out, so kind of painting that long-standing trend in the yoga world of emphasizing the importance of relaxing the glutes and back bends. I feel like these days, with a little more of like movement science knowledge making its way into the yoga world, I think more and more people are tuning into the fact that that's a little silly, like this idea that we need to relax. Like it's like you need the glutes are on because you're in hip extension, right? Like, why are we telling people to go out of their way to relax them? But as a counter to that, kind of in response, I feel like I've sensed more of a trend toward this emphasis that now everyone should be super actively engaging their glutes in the back bends, which you mentioned earlier, Travis, as well. And like you said, it's just, is that just kind of a nut taking it to another extreme? Like, do we really need to go out of our way to relax them or to actively contract them? Could we instead just kind of relax a little bit? I mean, relax like in a more, just like as far as micromanaging, just maybe not overthink it so much and just let our body embody the pose, the
So
asana that
so
we're
then
being
I guess
taught.
the question is, well, what do we tell them instead?
Right. Well, we can just talk about something else, maybe. Maybe we don't
Hmm.
need to cue all these specifics about overriding what people's nervous systems naturally do. And of course, in the case of if an individual might experience discomfort or pain in their
It's
back bend
different.
or in any asana, then it's different, and that's a very individual example.
Hmm.
But then you might, make some changes, shift the alignment or something like that. Even then, that may or may not
So
be so much about muscles.
So your options are either don't say anything at all
Mm-hmm.
and let people self-organize, or all right, could you think of an example of a cue that you might give? Just might not be related to that at all, but in where you once might have said something about the glutes, now what
Yeah,
would you say instead?
that's a great question.
Putting you on the
Um,
spot.
I think something that pops into my mind is if it's bridge pose, for example, maybe instead of teaching like squeeze your glutes and lift your hips up, or instead of teaching keep your glutes relaxed and lift your hips up, like I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't do either of those. Maybe
Hmm.
something like push your feet into the floor and
That's what
notice
I was
how
thinking too.
you were too,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
and notice how that just naturally lifts your hips up, and then just kind of let it be. Maybe you
Hmm.
could maybe instead of all of these super instructional cues, we can shift to more inquisitive cues, like what do you feel engaging? What happens if you're up in bridge and you drag your feet back towards you? Like what do you feel shifting as far as what's engaging? What if you push your feet forward? This is all isometric. The feet don't actually move. But like where
Hmm.
do you feel what's working? How does that shift when you make these
That's
changes?
fun.
What if you push one foot forward and pull one foot back at the same time? Like, does that
That's crazy.
trip everything up? And it's all the same. Like, you take a picture and put that in a yoga book. It's still bridge pose, but it's just all these shifts to how you're embodying it. And maybe it can be more of an exploration or a learning
So,
experience for
so
people.
you don't think that if you pushed one foot forward and pulled one back, that it might jam the SI joint?
Actually, I think that's super dangerous. And yeah, maybe that could jam the SI joint. We need to tell everybody about that. Teachers need to start teaching in bridge pose, like lift up to bridge and don't push one foot forward and pull one foot back. Make
Yeah,
sure you
yeah.
don't do
Here's what
that.
not to do.
Exactly. That's, yeah, seems silly, but it's kind of like what we're doing when we're telling people what to do with their
That's
glutes.
yeah. I mean, that's clearly a silly example, but that's exactly what happens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah, and just to be clear, and then I think we can move on from this good topic, but it's of course different when if it's like in a strength and conditioning context where you're lifting heavy weights and you're really intentionally trying to target a certain area, or maybe
Oh
you
yeah.
really are trying to quote grow your glutes for like a bigger booty or whatever, then you really may be wanting to intentionally make sure you're squeezing those muscles. But
Hmm.
in my mind, that's kind of a different context than a yoga asana class, right?
Totally. Yeah.
So it's yeah, it's about the
Although
context.
even in that, so in the case of the trying to connect the mind to the muscle to preferentially activate the glutes, yes,
Mm-hmm.
do think about that contraction. But if you're trying to, if your emphasis is more on strengthening than on muscle growth,
Right.
like if you're
Yeah.
trying to do a 1 rep max deadlift, you actually shouldn't think about squeezing your glutes. You should
Such a
think
good
about
point.
pushing your feet into the floor, or pushing the floor away would be like another external way, kind of focusing. Um,
That's
but
a
yeah, so
great
even within
point.
the strength training context, depending on whether you have more of a performance strength goal versus a hypertrophy muscle
Growth.
stimulus goal, yeah, that can, you can still maybe, oh, maybe I don't want to think about activating the glutes
Mm-hmm.
when my
If I'm
goals are more
just,
strength or performance,
it's yeah, it's more like I'm
because you
training a
want them,
movement pattern.
yeah, you want the movement to occur more automatically, as opposed to, again, that micromanaging of which
Right.
muscle's doing what and when.
It's so true. I love how you brought this. So it's definitely nuanced. And yeah, and I think that that speaks to there's like a whole other topic, and maybe we can do another podcast episode on more strengths, like the difference between strength and hypertrophy and like what that means and how you might think about that and incorporate that differently. But it's
Yeah,
such a good
you
point.
have a nice article on your website about those
I
types of
do.
cues.
Oh yeah, that
The
we wrote together.
ex yeah, external cues for, like, the sun salutation, I think, is an example
Yeah,
where
totally. The it's a
here's a
blog
bunch of cues.
post. Yes. So external versus internal cues, right? Is what you're
Hmm.
bringing up. And like with that
Hmm.
deadlift example, if you cue like squeeze the glutes, that's an internal cue. But if you cue push the floor away, that's an external cue. Both can be valid, but it just depends on your goal in the moment. Like what are you trying to achieve in the
Hmm.
what are you moving
And so,
toward in
yeah,
that
same thing
movement?
with a yoga asana, right? You could,
Yeah,
there
for
might be
sure.
reasons why you would want to use internal and external, and it's all in the
Hmm.
blog post, so check it out.
It's all in the blog post, which we will link in the show
Linked in
notes.
the
I
show
think it's
notes.
called "What's the Best Way to Cue Yoga Poses" or some cue movement in yoga. It's something like that, and it
Hmm.
yeah totally plays into this. Thanks for bringing that up. That we have the most awesome graphic in that blog post that you created, Travis, which is a
Yeah.
sun salutation broken down through all the stages and how you can cue like one cue example for all of the movements, and we have external and internal cue examples. It's so cool, and we just like made that and put it out there, free education. Anyway, so do you think I think that that kind of should wraps up our talk about the glutes and backbends. Of course there's more we can say, but we have other stuff to move on to, right, in this
Hmm.
conversation.
Hmm.
Okay, so we're still talking about the glutes, but maybe now instead of backbends and yoga asana, what about glutes and their relationship to pain?
Ooh,
Do you think that that might be a good
it's a
topic to
spicy
discuss?
one.
Yeah, right, right. I know you know a lot about this too, being a rehabilitation scientist and studying, which is like the rehabilitation sciences is kind of would am I correct in saying it's like the science of physical therapy,
Hmm. Hmm.
kind of in a casual sense. And
Yeah.
physical therapy is like this therapeutic field that treats people in pain.
Hmm.
So it seems like really relevant here, but
This is up my alley.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Do you find the glutes discussed often in terms of treating pain?
Yeah, I would say that there's a big emphasis on strengthening the glutes and targeting the glutes in a variety of musculoskeletal pain and injury conditions. Like if you
Mm-hmm.
have knee pain and back pain and hip pain,
Mm-hmm.
I would even go so far as to say that the glutes might be considered a magic muscle by some.
A
And
magic muscle.
we've brought that up before in the context of the psoas,
Mm-hmm. A big
which
magic
is
muscle.
funny because the psoas and the hips do opposite joint actions.
The psoas and the glutes do.
Sorry, the
Sorry, is that what
psoas
you
and the
mean?
glutes. Yeah, the
Yes.
psoas and the glutes do opposite things. So how could they both be magical?
Can't there only
Granted,
be
in
one
our
magic
there
muscle?
can only be one magic muscle, and it's the piriformis. No,
Actually, the
um,
piriformis isn't that when I teach about magic muscles, that's one I include as one that's often pulled out and made more special than it probably is.
yeah,
Piriformis.
yeah. But anyway,
But yeah. So you
so
think the
there's
glutes are a magic muscle, and even in the field of something like physical therapy?
yeah, I think that there's a lot of emphasis on exercising the glutes in a variety of conditions, and I don't think that it's wrong. I think that it can be
Mm-hmm.
helpful.
Right, right, right.
I think that the mechanism or the underlying what's actually going on, it might
Mm-hmm.
not be as cut and dry as maybe we think. So for example, let's say that you have knee pain and
Mm-hmm.
you're um, you are undergoing a course of physical therapy, and they say, okay, we're going to strengthen the glutes in hip extension and hip abduction, and that's going to fix your knee tracking, and because your knee is going into valgus or a knock knee position when you jump, run,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. So we're going to strengthen these muscles, and that's going to cure your pain. And maybe you do strengthen those muscles, or you exercise those muscles and it helps with your pain, but it isn't necessarily the case that you solved the person's it's not necessarily the case that the reason that the pain
Mm-hmm.
resolved or subsided is because you strengthened the glutes, because for one thing you were probably strengthening a lot of other muscles in
Right.
conjunction. You're not just going to do a glute program to work on your
Mm-hmm.
knee pain, you're going to do lots of other exercises too. But also, oftentimes the pain can get better without actually changing anything about the way that the person's moving. So,
Mm-hmm.
or even changing the person's strength.
Yeah,
So,
totally,
so
totally.
there's a I'll have to figure out what paper this was, but there was a systematic review from a few years ago that looked at hip strengthening for knee pain, and they found, actually maybe the better term for this, if you refer back to our episode with Adam Meekins where we talked about the difference between resistance and strength
Oh
exercises.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
so briefly, strength exercises would be exercises that actually strengthen, and
Right.
resistance exercises would be kind of lighter load exercises that are working those muscles but maybe not having a true strengthening effect from the standpoint of improving force production. So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, these two things get lumped together often. So in that paper, maybe they referred to it as strengthening, but what the paper concluded was that you can do exercises to strengthen the hips, including the glutes, and you might not actually get any
Right.
strength gains as a result of those exercises because they're underloaded. So the
Mm-hmm.
exercises, the load that the people are using within the studies for those exercises are not sufficient to create a strength adaptation. Yet the people still tend to get better in both their pain decreases and their function increases.
Right.
And so that leads us to wonder, well, why is this working? And maybe
Was it
it's working for other reasons, like the person is just like movement in general is good,
mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
maybe their confidence is improving.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe
Confidence in their body.
yeah, maybe I don't know what else could be going on.
So many it could movement and exercise in general can decrease inflammation, like chronic low grade inflammation in the body. And that can be like the systemic process that can just sensitize people to feel pain. like when people have low grade inflammation, that can make them more sensitive to feeling pain and experiencing pain. So exercise can have a decreased effect on inflammation. And we also know from our last podcast episode, we talked about stress, markers of stress, and how exercise
Right.
can play a role in just decreasing stress levels. And that can also potentially help with pain. The more stressed you are, again, your system just may be a little more sensitive and you may therefore feel more pain. So more of these general, bigger picture ways that just movement in
Yeah.
general might be helpful.
Exercise just being an analgesic. So not only the inflammation itself, like, oh, maybe there is an effect on the inflammation, but also just your pain sensitivity decreases. And then also like having more sense of control over your pain
Mm-hmm.
by, oh, if I do these exercises, my knee doesn't hurt as much.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it just seems like it's easy to want to give these just really simple explanations like you have knee pain because your glutes are weak. Like it's just like you have this because of that. And in order to fix the knee
Mm-hmm.
pain, you need to strengthen your glutes. So
Yeah. Well,
and then
and
yeah.
there's so the maybe we should have started with this. Oftentimes people will say, like you said, oh, you have knee pain because your glutes are weak. You have back pain because your glutes are weak.
Mm-hmm.
But or you have back pain because you have an anterior pelvic tilt, which
Uh-huh. I'm
means
glad
that
you're
your
bringing
glutes are
this
weak.
up.
And so
Oh, this
the
is a
problem with that
whole
is that
huge thing.
nobody ever bothers to actually strength test the glutes.
Right.
It's just
Right.
assumed that the person's glutes are weak. And it's not to say that they're not. Like maybe the people's glutes are weak. But if you don't actually test that, then
A
you're just
hundred
guessing
percent.
that the person's glutes are weak.
Can we take a little step back since you brought up anterior pelvic tilt? Because I think some of our listeners may or may not be familiar with what that means and how
Mm-hmm.
that's discussed, like especially in a yoga and a movement context. But
Yeah.
we have our pelvis, which we were talking about, and the glutes are on the back and the side of the pelvis, and our pelvis can tilt forward and backwards. And that's an anterior tilt is forward and a posterior tilt is backwards. And there are these ideas out there that are honestly pretty outdated now, but they're still super widespread. There's these ideas that like our pelvis needs to be in quote unquote neutral positioning in order for us to have like optimal alignment and to live in pain-free bodies and avoid injury and just all this stuff. Like you need to have a neutral pelvis. So therefore not one that's too forward tilted and not one that's too backward tilted, but it needs to be just right at neutral. And yeah, if you picture your pelvis as like being filled with water, because it's kind of the pelvic bowl picture that it has water in it. And anterior pelvic tilt is if the water were spilling forward, so your pelvis tilted in a way that you'd spill the water forward. And a posterior pelvic tilt is if you tilted your pelvis back and the water might spill back. So these ideas are out there that like you need to set your pelvis in neutral so that that water just doesn't spill forward or back. And that's where you're in optimal alignment and where you'll avoid pain. So I tend to see this brought into yoga so often and in so many classes out there where it's just taught that people really need to find that neutral pelvis. And there's this belief out there that if people's pelvises in their natural resting posture are tilted too far forward, and that's called an anterior pelvic tilt, and that term is so widespread out there that it's even abbreviated APT. You may hear that too if you have an APT. But if your pelvis is tilted too far forward, the idea is that will create back pain and all sorts of other pains. And the idea is that your glutes are weak if you have anterior pelvic tilt because they're in a slightly stretched position if your pelvis is tilted forward a little bit. And there's these mistaken ideas that like just because the muscle's a little stretched, it's therefore going to weaken. Like that's not really how strength works anyway. But so we tend to hear that in order to quote correct anterior pelvic tilt, we need to do lots of glute strengthening so that we like reset so that the weak glutes strengthen up and they therefore pull the pelvis back from the forward tilt into neutral. And paired along with that is these ideas that your hip flexors on the front side, so they cross the front of the hip, that the idea that those are tight and that they're tight and they're pulling the pelvis into that anterior tilt. So the solution to APT is strengthen the glutes and stretch the hip flexors. Would you say that I'm summarizing that correctly, Travis?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Mm-hmm. It's also called, you may hear this called lower cross syndrome. That's another term
Mm-hmm.
for the anterior pelvic tilt. It's just this belief that it's a widespread problem, that everybody has like tight hip flexors and weak glutes, and it's because, we sit all the time in our society or whatever, and that's non-optimal. And so brought into a lot of yoga classes these days, I tend to see an emphasis on the importance of strengthening the glutes in order to like correct posture, like to change pelvic tilt and get it back to that optimal neutral. And I personally actually I have an issue with that for many reasons. The first of which being it's just not evidence based. Like that's not how the body and pain and strength works. Like we know that definitively by now. But second of all, aside from the fact that that approach isn't even evidence based, I really strongly believe that unless a yoga teacher is also a medical professional, if we're just yoga teachers, it's not within our scope to be uh, diagnosing and pathologizing people and their body postures and pain. Like it's just, yoga is about teaching yoga. It's not about telling people that like their bodies are dysfunctional and that the way that they're using and moving their bodies is leading to pain. It's not a yoga teacher's role, and they're not qualified to do that. And I just don't think we need to talk about that stuff in yoga. I think we could just like remove that and leave it to professionals who are actually trained and licensed and qualified to help people with things like painful issues. What do you think about that, Travis?
Mic drop. Nailed it.
Thanks for saying that.
So apart from the fact that that's all nonsense anyway, we shouldn't even be talking about that in a personal training or yoga context,
Personal
in
training
it
as
like a
well.
fitness context. Yeah,
That's
this
right.
is if that even were something that was worth worrying about, that would be a medical scenario
100.
that
Thanks
a
for saying
physical
that.
therapist would
Yep.
be the best person to
Yep.
address.
Ideally, and
No, so if you're a physical therapist and a yoga teacher, that's now you could theoretically start getting into that. But
theoretically,
it's
but
it's a bunch of hogwash anyway. So
it's about exactly. So if you're a physical therapist and a yoga teacher and you're teaching your group classes that they have anterior pelvic tilt and their glute, therefore their glutes are weak and they have back pain, that's even though you're a physical therapist, that's not an evidence-based approach.
right. So
It's
the
not a
maybe
good idea.
the one wrinkle there is that when people, like if you measure a large number of people, on average people will have a slightly
Yeah.
anteriorly tilted pelvis. Maybe you mentioned that already, but
I didn't
we're
on it, but
talking
I wanted
like
us to mention this. Yeah.
yeah, what is it, 7 degrees or something. So an anterior pelvic tilt is normal. uh
Hmm.
so I don't know, maybe there's confusion here. Even like maybe when people talk about a neutral pelvis, they're actually referring to a slight anterior tilt.
That's not my
I don't know.
impression. I don't think
Okay.
so.
Well, if they maybe they should be, because that's what
Right.
normal actually is.
Because what you're
Unless
saying
you're
is
going to
there.
say like, oh, people who are have a normal average anterior pelvic tilt are pathological.
Exactly, because there are multiple research studies that have analyzed asymptomatic people, meaning pain-free people, like healthy people, analyzed their pelvic tilt, and it's found that, and it's something like I have the figures here. It's like 85% of males and 75% of females, pain-free asymptomatic people, their resting posture is an anterior pelvic tilt. That's what you're saying, right? Like the
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
normal, average, asymptomatic resting posture is technically what would be considered an anterior pelvic tilt.
So
So if
we're
we're
pathologizing
Mhm.
normal.
we're pathologizing normal by telling them that their APT is dysfunctional and is going to cause them pain. Because if the
Mm-hmm.
majority of people have anterior pelvic tilt and they don't have pain, like there's so many people that have that tilt and don't have pain. And there are people who
It's
have
going to
like a
cause them
posterior
pain
pelvic
later.
tilt. Yeah, exactly. You
The
fortune teller.
biomechanical boogeyman.
100%. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. So it's just like variability is really the norm. And you can find people in such a different variety of postures. Some of them may have some pain, many of them may not have pain. And we can't make these like black and white conclusions that like this always means this. It's just far more complex than that. So, in my opinion, I just don't think we need to be bringing in language like that in yoga at all. There's so many other things we can focus on, especially things that are positive and empowering and help people feel good about their bodies, which actually we know
Mm-hmm.
from research that emotions and psychology and things like confidence in your body, all of that can really feed forward into feeling less pain. So if
Yeah. So
anything, that's, yeah, sorry, go on.
we can strengthen the glutes. That's fine. But then not to
Right.
try to correct anterior pelvic tilt, because that's not something that needs to be corrected. Unless
100%.
it's
And
like a really extreme
right.
scenario, which again would not fall within our scope.
A yoga teacher scope of practice. Yeah.
Mhm.
Right. And also, Travis, you mentioned this a little earlier, but I just wanted to reiterate and highlight it again. But you mentioned that it's really common to hear in yoga movement fitness settings, people are being told that their glutes are weak because they have an anterior pelvic tilt. And basically that's like the personal trainer or the yoga teacher is just declaring that based on what they see with their eyes. They see an anterior pelvic tilt. But as you so rightly pointed out, when do they ever test glute strength? Aren't they just making an assumption based on this pelvic tilt that they see? But when do they actually test whether someone actually has weak glutes? Like, are they actually testing that in a measurable way?
Right. There actually is an okay way to test that, which I haven't even seen broadly used, but something that I've done in my research, looking more, we were interested in core stability or
Mm-hmm.
core neuromuscular control. And so this test kind of does both, but you have someone start in a two-legged glute bridge. So hook lying position, feet are flat on the floor on your back. Bridge your hips up to make a straight line from your shoulders to your knees, and then extend one leg.
So you mean
So
lift a leg? Is that what you mean? Like lift one foot
yeah,
off the
yeah.
floor?
Sorry, extend one knee. So now you're in a single leg
Reaching.
glute bridge.
Okay.
You're in a single leg glute bridge. Arms are up towards the ceiling, so you can't get any support from your hands. And then the test that we do is like, okay, how long can you hold that position? And then, but you have to have your pelvis level. So
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
control aspect that we look at is, okay, if as soon as you go to straighten the one leg, lift the foot off the ground, does your hip drop towards the side of the leg lifted? Well, that could be a sign of just a lack of awareness of your body position in space, or it could be external rotation weakness.
Right.
And you'd have to troubleshoot that with more testing to figure out which one it was. But sometimes for some people, like as soon as they go to extend that one leg, they get a hamstring cramp on
Oh yeah.
their glute side. And so
Mm-hmm.
that could be an indication that the person's glutes are weak because their hamstrings are having to work extra hard in this
Mm-hmm.
position to try to extend their hips. So, and we have some normative data that show like how long people, men and women, are able to hold that position. It's probably like 15 or 20 seconds is normal.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're much less than that, or if you're cramping right away, maybe you do have glute weakness, but nobody is testing that. They're
No,
just
like in a
looking at the
yoga
person.
setting when they're just
Yeah.
saying that.
And in any setting,
Yeah.
even in a PT setting, I don't think that they really test that
Test it. They just assume
all
it
that
based
much.
on what they
Yeah.
see.
And the other exercise that you could do would be either a side lying leg lift for
Mm-hmm.
repetitions. So that would be looking at the abductors, of course.
Like a
But
gluteus
there's,
medius.
yeah. So I can't remember what the norms are for that, but there's a certain number of reps that you're supposed to be able to do. And if you wanted to make it really hard, this is a test that I like and used with athletes, is you do that in a side plank. So you're in a side plank and then you raise the top leg up and down and see how
That's
many times you
hard.
can do it in a period of 30 seconds. It's really
Right.
hard. And if you do it well, then like you're strong.
Right.
Your lateral hips are strong.
But something that we talked about actually with Adam Meekins in the other podcast episode was that just because someone may have a weak muscle doesn't necessarily mean that like that is reason alone to mean that that's what's causing their pain. Like
Oh yeah.
someone may have weak glutes, but that doesn't mean that's why they have back pain or hip pain or
No,
knee
just
pain.
means that they have weak glutes. Yeah.
Yeah, it just means exactly. So they might want to strengthen them if they want stronger glutes, but it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily mean that's why they have pain. Additionally, I think we know from plenty of research, and I've got lots of citations for this, but that strengthening and stretching exercises that people that we do, they don't change posture anyway, and
Right.
they also don't change how we move. Like kinematics is like a term for that. They don't change those things anyway, and a lot of kind of outdated physical therapy approaches, and then of course the outdated way they're brought into yoga, treats the body as though when you stretch, you'll change your posture, or if you strengthen your glutes, that will pull you out of that anterior pelvic tilt position.
Yeah.
We know from research that doesn't work. Like,
Yeah. And even we've talked about this before, but like, just let's say you do have knee pain and you're exhibiting knee valgus or a knock knee position. And so we say,
mhm,
okay, we have to work those hip abductors and hip external rotators. Just because you strengthen those things doesn't mean that it's going to magically carry over.
right,
Maybe they have to be strong in order to have knee tracking that's not knock kneed.
dropping in,
But
yeah,
yeah, but you have to do some sort of control retraining, which
yeah,
is not, it's not just automatically going to be, oh, I strengthened this muscle, now when I run, jump, whatever, my knee magically tracks
right.
in you know
Just because I
in
strengthened.
alignment with my ankle and hip. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Because whether your knee drops in as you run or jump or whatever, that, like you said, you need some baseline level of strength to prevent that. But in addition to that, and probably more important, or just bigger picture, is just it's more about that's how you move, and how you move doesn't just automatically change when you strengthen.
Yeah,
You need
it's
to
like
retrain.
if we were computers, it's like the hardware and the software. So the
Right.
muscles are the hardware, but then you have to reprogram the software.
Which is like the nervous system and your
Yeah,
motor
which is
patterns
pretty
and
pretty hard to do.
right, because totally, it's hard to do. Yeah, so there's just it's really easy to think of the human body as like a puppet or something. Like you just pull these strings where you lengthen a little
Mm.
here and then you strengthen a little here, and then that lengthen and that tighten things up, and you're just like, I don't know, like tweaking with like a wrench, like changing people's position that way. And that's just totally not how it works, because Travis, what controls our posture? Is it short and tight and long muscles? Is it like muscle length and muscle tightness and things like that, or is it something else that determines our posture?
More of a conscious decision about how to hold oneself.
Right, which is like based maybe not so much in the muscular system, but what system of the body is that rooted in?
The nervous system.
Which is so much more complex than we often tend to realize. It's like we try to think about these problems as though it's just about like the muscles and the tissues, but there's this huge system, the nervous system, that's really driving all of it. And when we want to make change, that's where pain is from the nervous system as well. And so if you want to change pain, it's like more about nervous system approaches than like stretching and strengthening. Although stretching and strengthening can have bigger picture effects that do make changes in the nervous system, but it's just not about these
Yeah.
specific
So
claims.
it's again focusing on glute strengthening or glute resistance exercise in all those painful conditions is totally 100% appropriate,
A good thing, right?
and it can be helpful as part of as one component of rehabilitation program, but it's not, it's the explanation that we find problematic in terms
Yeah.
of because of this, then that.
Right.
It's
And
just not that
boiling it all
simple.
down to the glutes. Like we know there's a study that I pulled to maybe mention in this conversation, but there was this great study I made a YouTube video about that we'll also link in the show notes. But this study looked at women who had patellofemoral pain, which is pain at the front of their knee, and it was like 52 women. And generally when people have that type of knee pain, it's often traditionally they're prescribed glute strengthening, because it's just some of these same beliefs we've already been talking about. That's like the traditional approach is the front of your knee hurts, we need to strengthen those glutes, and that's always what's been done. So these researchers were like, well, no one's ever tested what happens if maybe we don't strengthen the glutes for knee pain, but instead we strengthen the opposite muscles, which is like the hip flexors and the
The
adductors. So
other
basically
magic muscles.
yeah, exactly, on the other side of the joint. So instead of strengthening the muscles that do abduction and extension, we strengthen the muscles that do hip flexion and adduction, basically the complete opposite muscles. And so they did this study where they divided the women into two groups, and half of the women got like adduction and hip flexion. I mean, half the women got exercises for, okay, I have the actual technical terms. It's traditionally when people are prescribed glute strengthening for like knee pain, that's posterolateral hip group. That's targeting the
Hmm.
posterior and lateral, what we've been talking about.
Hmm.
But less traditionally, and also not tested before the study, was actually treating people with anteromedial hip group, targeting that, so the front and the inside of the hip. That's the better way of saying it than I was trying to explain
Mm-hmm.
it. So anyway, they basically gave these two groups of women that both had the same front of the knee pain. Half got posterolateral, half got anteromedial exercises, and in the end, they both performed the same. Like both groups of women
How
had the
could that
same
be?
decrease in pain. Right. And yeah, totally. Because maybe when people do strengthening exercises, maybe it's less about the specific tissue and more about maybe these more bigger picture global things going on that are interacting with the nervous system, and not so much about, it's like maybe it doesn't matter, right? Like you could strengthen the glutes, it's fine, but we don't necessarily need to hold the glutes up as more important than maybe all these other muscles we could also strengthen. Like
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's a good idea to think about just targeting the hip joint all the way around in a well-rounded way. So the back, the lateral, the front, and the inner, like all of it. Maybe that's a good idea. And maybe we don't need to pull the glutes out as like this magic muscle. Travis, I think a last point that we wanted to cover, and maybe we'll just kind of try to cover this quickly, is
Mm-hmm.
the notion that, and this, it's super related to what we've been talking about already, but we tend to hear a lot of talk about people having asleep glutes or gluteal amnesia or glutes that are shut off, like things like, do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah.
Would you say that's a pretty widespread
Yeah,
belief and
I
claim?
for whatever reason I feel like I've heard it less lately, but
That's good.
definitely or maybe I just am tuning it out.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah, so you mentioned this before. It's like because we sit, our glutes
In
turn
chairs.
off. Yeah, and then we have to go out of our way to turn the glutes back on and activate them before we do any sort of
Right.
rigorous exercise or vigorous exercise. And that it's fine to warm up, which is what
Right.
activation exercises are.
I love how
Just
you said
low
that.
load, glute bridges, bird dogs, clamshells, um,
Hmm.
body weight squats and lunges or whatever. But it's not turning, and there
Not.
are potentiation effects that occur, but like yes, after warm up your muscles will fire more strongly than they did before, but it's not really like, oh, the glutes were off, they were
Yeah.
just off. There was the light switch was turned off. They were
Right.
in bed asleep.
Asleep. Right.
Yeah,
In bed.
because because you couldn't walk, you couldn't
Hmm.
move if your glutes were turned off or asleep, or you had gluteal amnesia, and you just like the line of communication between your nervous system, your brain, and your glutes, it was just
Off.
off or broken. Yeah, so it's not real. That doesn't
Right.
happen when you sit. It's not something that you have to worry about.
And oh, I'm sorry.
That's yeah.
Also, when discussing people sitting, like why are the glutes the ones that are the one muscle that's like highlighted as being negatively affected? I mean, your whole body is sitting. It's a whole body position. I
Yeah,
often
your
hear state,
hamstrings are on the chair too, right?
yeah, your hamstrings are on the chair
Nobody
too,
talks
right?
about that. Your low back's against the back of the chair. Why isn't that off?
Right. Why isn't that? And what's the mechanism for how they turn off? Just because they're being pressed on? Like, does that? What if you get a full body massage that's being pressed on all? Or could you not get off
Everything
the
turns
table then?
off.
Yeah, you're
Oh
just
my god.
like in you're just in shavasana on the table. You can't get up or something. It doesn't
Right.
like what's the mechanism for how they would? I don't understand. I also, my impression is like evidence based clinicians, like physical therapists who understand like the science behind all of this. The reason that I think it's kind of frowned upon using this type of language about asleep glutes is it's a potential nocebo that can give people like unhelpful beliefs about their body. It could just make them believe that their body is dysfunctional, like, oh, my glutes are not activated, and they're not firing correctly, and that's a problem, and I'm like
Yeah.
dysfunctional, and that can actually create pain when people have these beliefs about their body.
Yeah, if you think your glutes don't work and you're like worried about walking up and down the stairs, like, oh, I got to do my mini band clamshells before I like get out of bed because my I need to turn my glutes on because they've been asleep while I've been asleep,
Probably
or
your whole
after
body as
sitting
well.
or whatever. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That can be,
It
those
just
beliefs can have ramifications too.
Exactly. And in addition to these claims that sitting shuts off your glutes, I often just hear language around sitting weakens your glutes, which we want to be clear, muscle strength and weakness is actually a different variable from like muscle activation. Like activation is just more of that. I know I do understand that muscle activation is actually a really complex topic. Like there's neural excitation and muscle activation. It's more complex than I understand. But I think in this conversation we can just lump it up with just muscle activation, meaning like, can your motor neurons actually fire the muscle? Like, can they activate it? And as long as you're up and walking around, then your glutes are firing and activating. But anyway, I'm going on a little tangent. So muscle activation is one conversation, but then muscle weakness and strength, that's not the same thing as muscle activation, but people often lump them together. I think they want to say that a muscle doesn't activate and a muscle is weak, and like as though those things mean the same thing. But weakness is about force production, and strength is like the flip side of weakness in terms of force production. So claims that when you sit you weaken your glutes, I can't count the number of times I've heard that. But maybe we could take a step back and just see, like, well, when you're sitting, you're not really working any of you're completely sitting in a chair. So if, I mean, not that I want to be pessimistic or nocibic about sitting, but why pull out the glutes? I mean, in sitting, none of your muscles are being strengthened. So you could technically say sitting weakens your whole body, not just your glutes. And it only, it's not like you're sitting there just like growing weak. Like as long as you maybe strength train or do things, it's fine. But just, I guess it's just another example of how the glutes are a magic muscle. Like, why do we picture the glutes as being the one area that are quote weakened when we sit, when actually our whole body is participating in the sitting? So why do we talk about the glutes like that?
I have one of those ergonomic kneeling chairs, so you're
Mm.
kind of sitting, but your knees are down too,
Like,
and
yeah,
so
I think I could picture that.
yeah, I wonder if my knees are turning off too.
And your shins, like your tibialis
Yeah.
anterior, because your shins are touching the support, right?
Hmm.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So hopefully we just kind of wanted to bring this one up because it's very commonly heard out there, and it gets wrapped in with all these other narratives about weak glutes, about anterior pelvic tilt and lower cross syndrome, and just this whole emphasis on like the glutes are more important and more special than all the other 600 muscles in the human body. And I think that when you actually look at like movement science and the science of the body and the science of pain, maybe we can start to see it's a little bigger picture than that. Do
Yeah,
you think?
no, that's not to say they're not important, and they, uh, from an athletic performance standpoint, there probably is some merit to doing targeted
Hmm.
glute exercise
That's right.
for uh, strengthening and
And
power
growth.
and stuff like that. And yeah, if you just have aesthetic goals.
That's right. I'm really glad you mentioned that because I knew we wanted to make sure we mentioned. Yeah, there certainly are contexts where focusing on the glutes is helpful. And it's not to say that we should never focus on the glutes. I think it's just to say that the glutes seem to be pulled out a little too
Yeah,
much.
perhaps. Yeah, maybe they're outside of an aesthetic goal where, yeah, you have to target that thing if you want that thing to grow.
Hmm.
But from a full, a comprehensive performance paradigm, you can focus on the glutes just as much as you can focus on any of the other nooks and crannies of the hips, right?
Right. The front, the inside. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Now that they are a really voluminous muscle. They're a large muscle, so
Right.
they're important, but maybe they're not as important as some people make them out to be.
Exactly. And you're bringing up that important realm of like strength and performance and athletics, but then there's like the realm of pain, and then there's just the realm of like daily function and living and like sitting and chair. Like there's just all these ways that the glutes they just kind of get pulled out and discussed in ways that sometimes, like in the strength and performance sense, it makes sense. Like, of course, target that area just like you might target all these other areas for different reasons. But in other
Hmm.
contexts, maybe it's just not so helpful and can even be counterproductive to like focus on the glutes like that.
Yeah, or at least the narrative behind it.
Exactly. That's probably what's most important with maybe a lot of what we discuss here on the podcast, right? Is it's you don't necessarily need to change what you're actually doing, but maybe
Hmm.
how you're
Hmm.
talking about it. like we talked about in yoga, and you asked about how I might cue bridge pose differently, not focusing on the glutes so much and telling people what they need to do. It's like it's still bridge pose. Like we could still do the same thing. Everyone can do bridge pose, but maybe what makes a big difference is how the narrative we're couching that in, like what we're bringing people's minds to focus on and what their attention is on in these movements. So you don't have to change what you do, but maybe change the way you talk about it, think about it, present it, and teach it, and what type of attention you draw, because we know the brain is so powerful and the nervous system is so powerful, and everything about how we experience and feel our body. So yeah, so it just seems like explanations are important.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any other just like last takeaway thoughts about this topic, Travis, for our listeners?
I don't think so.
I think we kind of covered it pretty well, right?
We did it.
Yeah.
Did what we set out to do.
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing wrong with targeting the glutes, but we just want to keep in mind there's a bigger picture. And yeah, just maybe how we talk about it may shift away from like such a glute focused narrative. Like, let's strengthen all the way around the hip, all the muscles of the hip. There are a lot of them, a lot more than just the glutes. And while we're at it, why don't we just strengthen all the muscles of the whole body? Like all of our joints and all the ways they can move, and just there you go.
Sounds good to me.
Me too. Cool. Well, I think we've done a pretty good job covering this topic. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Thank you. I love talking about the glutes.
Maybe we can think of more things to talk about the glutes and do like a part 2 on the glutes or something at some point. But hopefully
If
what we
someone
covered.
can explain to us what jamming the SI joint means, then
Yes, like
we
what it
can do
means like
part two.
anatomically. I would love that. We're open to hear. I love that. Well, thank you, Travis.
Thanks, Jenni.